All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the BSDFS Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by Brian and Scotty. Unfortunately, Brian is on vacation this week and is unable to record, so you fine folks are stuck with only me for this week's edition of the podcast. This will be the first time we've done a solo recording of the podcast, so we appreciate your patience in the meantime while we get things back on track next week. So anyway, going to go right into some quarterbacks this week, and I'm going to go ahead and talk about some Drew Brees sitting at 6,900 going into Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay is currently ranked 27th against the pass, looking at the DVOA rankings, but they're actually ranked first overall in terms of their rush defense. So this is going to be a game where Brees is going to need to do a lot if the Saints want to win. He is averaging 44 attempts a game in the 3 full games that he has played, and it is actually the highest total on the Sunday slate at 50.5, with the Saints favored by 5.5. I know he's a little on the pricey side, but I do think he's in a really good spot, and I think he's going to put up some big numbers this coming up week in Tampa. So, unfortunately, this is the part where Brian would chime in a little bit, but I guess I'm going to have to just kind of press forward and go on to the next quarterback I want to talk about. So, this is definitely going to be some recency bias, but I do like some Kyle Allen going against Atlanta. He's sitting at a really good price point at 5,300, and he's going into a matchup against a Falcons defense that is 31st against the pass, according to the DVOA rankings. They're averaging a little over 260 passing yards per game allowed, and they're a pretty solid run D. They're averaging 111 rush yards allowed per game. This is also going to be the highest total on the Sunday slate. It's actually tied with the Tampa Bay New Orleans game at 50.5, and the Panthers are favored by 6. The reason I say this is kind of a recency bias pick is he is coming off a big game against Green Bay. I know it wasn't as high scoring as it could have been, I guess, but he is coming off his first 300 passing yard game of the season. He had 43 attempts in that game. He definitely did a lot and took over the offense for the most part. So I think he's in a good position to produce big numbers again this week in Atlanta, and he's sitting at a really good price point, and he can be paired up with some very affordable options at receiver and even tight end. So I think that's going to do it for the quarterbacks that I wanted to cover. Next up, we're going to go into some running backs. The first one I'm going to talk about is some Devin Singletary. He's sitting at 6,000 going into Miami. Miami is currently ranked 30th against the pass and the rush, according to DVOA rankings, and they're allowing 146 rushing yards per game. He's kind of taken over the backfield ever since coming back from his injury a few weeks ago, and he's slowly getting more and more work versus Frank Gore. He's sitting at 41 touches versus Gore's 26 over the last 3 weeks. So he ends up kind of being the more versatile and a little bit more explosive and a little bit more exciting option out of the backfield versus Gore. And the matchup against the Dolphins has Buffalo favored by 5.5, so this is going to be definitely a game where they can really run the ball a lot, and Singletary is going to be involved pretty heavily, and he's not too expensive considering how great of a matchup he's getting. So anyway, I'm not sure how obvious this pick will be, but I do like Brian Hill going into Carolina. He's sitting at 4,800, and Carolina is ranked 32nd against the run in the DVOA rankings, and they're actually allowing the 4th most rushing yards at 136. And if you look at the Atlanta backfield, it's practically non-existent at this point, with Freeman going down to injury, and he's probably going to be out a few weeks, and then Ito Smith's on IR. Hill stepped into the New Orleans game and took over lead back duties by a pretty big margin. He had 20 carries in that game, so he's sitting at a very good price point and a very good matchup. I'm a little worried he might end up being pretty high owned just because he is such a good price, but he is kind of hard to pass up. He's a bit of a, I guess what you call a free space kind of play, where you just can plug him into a bunch of lineups for cheap. But anyway, I really do like Brian Hill this week against Carolina. So the last running back is actually going to be on the other side of the Buffalo matchup. The Bills, they look to have a pretty good defense overall, but it's actually a little on the overrated side. So they're actually ranked 27th against the rush in the DVOA rankings. They're allowing 115 rushing yards per game. Oh wow, I forgot to talk about, since I mentioned his name, Kalen Alledge at 4,300. So he's kind of taken over the lead back role with, Drake out of town and Olsen on suspension. He had 20 carries last week against Indy. It's a pretty low total at 40.5, but it is a good matchup for Alledge, and he's at a very good price point. He is a little bit risky just because Buffalo might be able to get off to a big lead and kind of stop Miami from using the run game too much, but I mean, the Dolphins are red hot at the moment, sitting on a 2-game win streak, so now might be the time to invest in the Dolphins running attack. But anyway, he's a really good running back at 4,300. And wow, I'm rambling. Anyway, so let's go ahead and go to receivers next. I'm going to go ahead and start off with a pretty risky pick, just because it's going to be very difficult to predict how well this guy will do, but I do like some Terry McLaurin sitting at 5,600 going against the Jets. The Jets are 24th against the pass and 2nd against the run in the DVOA rankings. He's coming off a 3-game skid against all pretty good defenses. He's under 8 DraftKings points a game against San Francisco, Minnesota, and Buffalo. So he's definitely going to be under the radar coming into this matchup, but the Redskins are coming off of a bye week, which always helps. And that should be another week of Haskins kind of learning the offense and learning how things kind of run, essentially. And he should be a little bit more comfortable coming into this game against the Jets. And it'd definitely be a good bounce back point for Washington in general going against this team. So I think he's definitely going to be an under the radar pick that maybe not a lot of people are going to be looking at. So he's definitely a very good GPP play. And next up, let's see. I do like some Marquise Brown going against Houston. Houston is actually 3rd against tight ends in the DVOA rankings, and I think they're top 10 in the DraftKings rankings in terms of points allowed to tight ends. So it could be a game where Andrews and the other Baltimore tight ends aren't as heavily involved, and he is getting closer and closer to 100%. He did have an ankle injury there for a while, which kind of slowed him down a little bit. He wasn't quite living up to his full ability, but this game is going to be the 2nd highest total on the slate at 50 points, with Baltimore favored by 4. This is definitely going to be a good opportunity for him to bounce back, and he's at a pretty good price point. So overall, he's just a great receiver in a high scoring matchup, and think it'll be a good opportunity for him to bounce back as well. And I think last but not least, let's just talk about some Mohamed Sanu. He's sitting at 5,100 going into Philly. I am kind of chasing points here a bit, but he is coming off of a 14-target game, and then also a bye week in addition to that. Philly is kind of average against the pass so far, but they're a top 10 run defense. But I think their stats are padded a little bit. There are some not so great passing attacks mixed in there that maybe make them look a little bit better than they actually are. So Sanu, he's sitting at a very good price point, 5,100. He only went up $900 after the Baltimore game, so it's definitely going to be an opportunity to get a cheap wide receiver 1 into your lineups, and you definitely want to take advantage of this player while he's still at an affordable price. But anyway, I do like him going into Philly this week, and I think that's going to do it as far as receivers go. Excuse me. So we're going to go on to tight ends. The first one I want to talk about, oh goodness, is going to be some Jarrett Cook going into Tampa Bay to kind of pair up with the Drew Brees pick earlier. Tampa Bay is 29th against tight ends in the DVOA rankings, and Cook is starting to get a little bit more involved in the offense after being injured for a good chunk of the season. He's averaging 6.75 targets a game over the last 4 weeks, and he's putting up a pretty solid floor. He's averaging 11.33 DraftKings points a game over that span, and he is coming off of a fairly big game against Atlanta, a 10-target game. So he's sitting at a pretty good price point at 4,400. So he's going to save you a couple bucks over the more expensive options, and he's in a very good matchup, and hopefully he'll be able to find the end zone a few times this week. And the other one to pair with the Kyle Allen pick is some Olsen, sitting at 3,900 going against Atlanta. He's coming off of a 10-target game against Green Bay for 17.8 DraftKings points. I think it's probably the best game of the season so far for him. Let me double check that real quick before I look stupid. Okay, so it's his third best game of the season, but it's definitely his best game in 5-6 weeks. So anyway, Olsen is sitting at a great price point. He only went up $300 versus last week, and Atlanta's kind of average against tight ends. They're not really terrible against them, but they're not necessarily great either. I think Olsen's sitting in a good spot right now to kind of go along with Allen's increase in usage. So again, he's a tight end that's going to save you a good chunk of money over the elite options, and he's in a good spot to have a big game against Atlanta. And last but not least, let's go into some defenses, or, well, specifically one defense. Usually I end up I pick just one, and then Brian kind of helps us out and fills in at least one more, but I only got one that I want to talk about this week, and that's going to be the Raiders hosting the Bengals. They're sitting at 3,300. So Oakland is favored by 10.5, and Cincinnati is a bottom 5 team against the run in the DVOA rankings, and they're actually dead last in terms of rushing yards allowed per game at 173. Oakland defensively isn't too inspiring. They're kind of middle of the road in most categories, but I think this is going to be more of a play on their offense. They're ranked top 5 overall in the DVOA rankings, 4th in pass, and then 6th in rush offense. I think this is going to be a game where Josh Jacobs is going to get the ball a lot and just really gash that Bengals team and put them in a hole, and then force, Ryan Finley, the backup Bengals QB made starter, they're going to force him to do a lot, and I don't think he's going to be in a position to really do much, and there's going to be some turnovers in there. So I think this Raiders team is going to have a bit of a field day against this Bengals team that's just not doing great, to put it nicely. And let me think. I think next up, I could go into sneaky pick of the week, but I honestly don't really have one that I haven't really covered. Let's see, sneaky pick. I guess I go right into gut check then. So let's go ahead and pull up DraftKings real quick for my gut check of the week. I'm going to go ahead and plug in some Drew Brees, and I'm going to go ahead and pair him up with some Jarrett Cook. We're going to go over for running backs. I know it says Jacobs is questionable right now, but he had an injury last week and played through it, so it looks like it might be just kind of a maintenance-related thing. But I'd be surprised if he doesn't suit up against Cincinnati. So I'm going to go ahead and plug him in, and then we're going to go ahead and do the Raiders defense. I think the Raiders defense at 3,300 is just such a good price point. Like that should be a borderline $4,000 defense, but I guess for whatever reason, DraftKings wants to keep them not as expensive. But anyway, so the other running back, we're gonna go ahead and plug in some Brian Hill, and then receiver wise, the first receiver is going to be gonna go ahead and do some Marquise Brown. And let's see who else. Gonna do some new. And let me go ahead and plug in I'm going to go ahead and plug in some Hopkins because we got a little bit of extra money. So we're sitting at 4,900 left over. Scroll on down. Let's do some Devontae Parker going against Buffalo. He's had a pretty good 2 weeks. He's actually been probably the only consistent Miami Dolphins receiver, but anyway. So that's going to do it for the gut check. So I guess that's going to do it for the solo edition of the BSDFS Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and hopefully you can take these picks and go out there and win some money. So that's going to do it for us. Peace.